first learning session will be led by Suzanne Greenman. She will speak about executive leadership in asset management and what the C-suite needs to know. Suzanne is the president and principal asset management advisor of Greenman Asset Management Solutions, Inc., headquartered in Winnipeg. Suzanne is an accomplished asset management leader with over 22 years of experience. She has worked across several asset management disciplines to implement asset management strategies for cement manufacturing, power generation, wastewater treatment, and airport assets. After Suzanne has finished her presentation, we will open the virtual floor for any questions. If you have any questions during or after the presentation, please post them in the GoToWebinar questions box on the right. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Mario. Thank you to our sponsors as well for making this happen, and thanks to MRO and Annex Business for putting on this learning session. It's really good. Excellent. So today we're going to be talking about executive leadership in asset management, what the C-suite should know, and let's get right into it. So I'm just going to walk you through what we'll cover today in the presentation. Bit of an intro. Mario did an exceptional job, so I won't repeat that. But then we'll talk about the nature of asset-dependent firms. We'll talk about the role of top management in these firms, and then some specific asset management responsibilities. So Mario covered much about me, and look how joyous I look. I miss conferences. That's my conference face. I also volunteer a whole lot professionally, and I'm quite proud to be associated with the ISO TC 251 Mirror Committee for Canada, as well as with PMAC as the Winnipeg chapter president, and some other areas as well. By discipline, I'm an engineer with an MBA, and I also have some other certifications. All right, so here at Greenman Asset Management, we carry a very specific skill set in that we combine asset management principles with organizational excellence and systems engineering principles to make sure that whatever we're proposing to our clients, that it's holistic and it is sustainable. Our clients tend to come from asset-intensive companies, so the large multi-tiered organizations such as airports, power plants, wastewater treatment plants. That's where we play, that's where we intend to stay. So let's talk a little bit about asset-dependent firms. First of all, there's a certain reality about these organizations. They're very important assets to stable economic life, so some of them may even be national assets. What are we talking about? Power plants, water treatment plants, airports, railways, seaports, things that companies that have national and global reach, such as your huge manufacturers. These organizations, however, tend to have a natural inertia about them. They're capital, energy, and data intensive. They're also complex assets with very long life cycles, and asset changes are rare. As a matter of fact, you could work your whole life, maybe 20 years or more in a company, and never see asset changes. So because of this, some people speculate that this has led to kind of impervious organizational culture and industrial culture as well. To further complicate matters, because the cultural and process changes are so rare and difficult, then some of these companies, I say some because not all, may be slow to adopt changes. What this means, however, is that these companies are at significant risks. So they have been weakened internally by factors such as aging assets, inappropriate business systems, and human factors, but they're also threatened externally by global socio-economic factors, such as what we're experiencing now with COVID. So let's talk a little bit about who exactly top management is. So top management for organizations tend to be the combination of the board of directors and the executives. So we're talking about the highest level of governance in the organization. Another term that you might see them as is senior management. So organizational configurations vary. So I can't tell you exactly what all the titles are in your company because they vary from company to company depending on how the companies are set up. So because of that, it isn't always clear, especially to the folks at the bottom of the organization, as to who really top management is. So one rule of thumb that we say in industry, look for the persons who you can't criticize. But being very, very serious about everything now, we're looking for that group that's responsible for governance and strategy, but also strategy execution and general management of the organization. So we're looking for board of directors, elected officials, boards of regents, board of governors, positions like your CEO, CAO, CFO, your COO, plant manager, chief HR officer. That's the lot that we're talking about. So they really come together to comprise that group that is called top management. So what exactly do they do in organizations? And a lot of things, but I think I picked out about 5 of them here. So firstly, they need to determine the purpose and vision of the organization, determine the corporate values and promote them throughout the organization, and establish and continually review the goals of the organization. So that's a main function of top management. Secondly, they need to continually assess threats, opportunities, and risks, and then develop and adjust the strategy to cope with these threats, opportunities, and risks. So in other words, they need to look at all the options that are available and devise what the strategic option, the right strategic option for the organization is going to be. Thirdly, resourcing. They need to establish an appropriate structure for the organization. And this is going to become very important as we move forward with asset management. What is that appropriate structure going to be? How is the asset management structure going to align with the rest of the organizational structure? So establish the appropriate structure, determine the resourcing levels for the organization. And again, the resourcing could be a mix of internal and external resources. And then appoint key personnel. So for example, the board will appoint the CEO, the board and the CEO will appoint the CFO, and then they will appoint the rest of the organization, etc. Fourthly, the top management, the board and the executives are responsible and accountable to the stakeholders. So we want them to establish communication with key stakeholders, especially the external ones. And here we're talking about regulators, government, and insurers, etc. Things, stakeholders that are in your external environment, very powerful stakeholders. Determine what these people want or organizations want from the company. So determine the interests of the key stakeholders and then monitor these relationships. So don't let the relationships fall apart. Don't let things play out in the press when it could have been handled a different way. So proactively engage the stakeholders of the organization. And finally, they are responsible for governance. So exercise oversight of the organization and the organizational activities, establish policies, govern and administer by these policies that they have established. And more on that a little bit later. So what exactly is driving the need for top management to be involved with asset management? Why do we need the specific attention of the board and the executives? So first of all, the asset management transformation is exactly that. Can't put it any other way. It's a transformation of the way that asset-intensive firms operate. It's not a project. It's not an initiative. It's not merely to be confined to the development of your strategic asset management plan. As a matter of fact, many organizations years ago set about to do asset management plans only to declare now that they're not very useful because there was no system put in place to actually achieve the results of the plan. It is a fundamental shift in the way that many organizations do business, and for that, we need a sustainable approach that is applied over time, and for that, you definitely need the attention of the senior leaders of the organization. Top management is responsible to the stakeholders for value creation. So the buck stops with top management. At the end of the day, all other levels of management have what we call delegated responsibilities, but the buck stops with top management. Bear in mind as well that it's the operational use of the asset that creates, the assets rather, that create value. This means is that the operational use of the asset is also a source of risk, both financially and operationally. Therefore, as we know, the failure of any major asset could present significant risk, production losses, operational losses, other direct negative impact to cash flow, and so on. So as a result, executives and boards need to get closer to the operations and have a closer relationship with the assets. Given that capital projects, as a follow-up from the point before, capital projects are often funded from debt. Then if you have to replace an asset under emergency conditions, what it means is that you're gonna either plunge a company into debt or dry up your cash flow, which are things that you might not be prepared for. So therefore, again, stressing the need for top management to have a closer relationship with the asset. In many organizations, financial information is not aligned with operational information. So what this leads to is a lack of visibility on both sides of the business. So the operational side, they're not aware of asset cost performance and risk. And then the financial side, they're also not aware of which activity is causing value leakage. The challenge with this is that by the time we figure it out on the balance sheet, it is way too late. It becomes a lagging indicator at that point in time. The current culture in many organizations don't facilitate an easy transformation to an asset management culture. So we have a lot of things that are desirable in the organization, in the asset management culture, but the current culture of the organizations don't facilitate that. So we need top management, because they control the resources, the culture, and the reward systems that reinforce it, to get involved in ensuring that the culture is one that facilitates value creation. So therefore, in the organization, top management cannot simply leave all of this cultural maneuvering to middle management. All that is going to do is create organizational conflict. And then, asset-intensive firms are usually structured into areas of specialization. This is typically how organizations are set up. Now, these silos are structural. So what we're looking for is to have business processes that can bridge the gap across these silos. Many departments are independently led, and what they then do is independently create their own processes for the assets without consultation or input from the other departments. So based on the current maturity of asset management practices in a lot of firms, structural changes, and by that I mean changes to the organizational structure, may be required to be able to successfully deploy the asset management policy and the rest of the asset management system. And unfortunately, as you know, middle management is simply not vested with the authority to be able to do that. And so now we want to check what roles the executives and board have been playing in your asset management system currently. So Mario, I'll hand over to you to administer the poll.
We have our answers. Suzanne, back over to you.
Thank you so much. So what I'm seeing is a little more than 50% have at least some awareness. Well, 31% don't have a system yet, and 14% are kind of struggling. So if you add the 14 and the 31, would suggest that we need a little bit more involvement from top management. But great, it's very heartening to see the 24% that have active involvement from the board and the executives. Thank you so much, Mario. All right, so let's talk about what are the specific asset management responsibilities for top management. So first of all, remember that the asset management strategy needs to articulate how it will achieve and align with the strategy of the organization. We're talking about the vision, the long-term mission, but also the near-term objectives of the organization. So what this means is that we need top management to articulate what that strategy is that we're pursuing right now as an organization, but also what the future strategy of the organization is going to be. Another important thing that is often missed is that we want top management to establish the asset management office and the governance. So they need to formalize an asset management office. And I'm not speaking of a physical space here. I'm speaking about getting the asset management mandate going, authorizing the asset management system, determining the governance, authorizing the policy, and formalizing all of that in the organization. We also want them to establish the asset management governance, and by that we mean the structure, determine who are the people who are going to play key roles in the asset management system, set up a structure that aligns with the rest of the organizational structure, have clear roles and responsibilities for each of the governance group, but also what other people do as it relates to the asset management system, create pathways and opportunities for they themselves to be involved and engaged with the asset management system, and have systems of monitoring from the top management level, especially at the executive level, what is happening with the asset management system. We want them to provide adequate resources, because bear in mind, the asset management office will need to prepare policies, revise policy, create strategies, probably engage consultants, but develop asset management tools, templates, and processes for the organization. We also want them to provide the right mix of resources. So your asset management resources could be any mix of your internal specialists, internal subject matter experts, consultants, whatever it is. At the end of the day, the asset owners must be actively engaged in asset planning, regardless of who else is also doing some heavy lifting on that. The other thing we want top management to do is to champion asset management practices. So specifically practices around value creation, life cycle costing, value-based decision making. Reinforce them in the organization and continually monitor them to make sure that nothing is being sidetracked. We want top management to do something that I call create cohesion, disruption, and collaboration at the middle management level. So let's start with cohesion. Now, we all know that strategy and initiative live or die at the middle management level of the organization. So their engagement is key. For the asset management effort to be successful in the organization, top management needs to create cohesion at the middle management level. This way we can get middle management to model, embrace, support, and participate in the asset management transformation. It can't happen without them. Then we want collaboration. So bear in mind that asset management is a multidisciplinary approach that incorporates and encompasses almost all the various functions in the organization. So all the functional groups, sometimes you call them departments, need to be involved because they're all doing asset management in one way or the other. So we want top management to encourage the collaboration, but also to specifically require it. So not just say it's a nice thing, but require it in the processes. And then we want top management to discourage what I call the homogeneous intellectual landscape, otherwise known as groupthink. What can happen in organizations? You can have cliques form that then turn against the asset management system or decide in themselves that it's not important, it's not relevant to them. And these groups can be quite powerful. And sometimes it happens in subtle ways. And one way that it happens is through circumvention of the asset management process. So we want top management to not entertain circumvention of the asset management process. And then I'm going to say, Top management needs to use their business processes and their HR tools to ensure that senior management and middle management participate in things like audits and assessment and retain ownership of the action items. So in other words, what I'm saying is that if you can't get particular senior managers or middle managers to come on board with the asset management effort, it's not an asset management problem that you have, it's an organizational problem. We also want top management to be focused on aligning financial and non-financial information in the organization. What do we mean? In the typical asset-intensive organization, we all know that goods and services go in and then products and services come out. But there's a whole sea of either business-centric processes or asset-centric processes that happen in between that to make this possible. So from an information perspective, the asset registry must align with the chart of accounts for the organization. The chart of accounts must align with the cost centers. The cost centers must align with the work order system, or let me put that the other way around. The work order system must align with the chart of accounts and the cost centers. The PO system must align with the work order system and with the inventory system, etc. So for this alignment, you need good business processes and management systems to make it happen. And that is why we talk about establishing an asset information management system. We want top management as well to create financial literacy in the organization. What we've realized is that people are making decisions in the organization, but they're not seen as decision making. But every decision spends money in the organization or saves money. It's doing one of the two. There is no in between. So we want top management to ensure that all levels of decision makers know how asset activities become balance sheet activities and income statement activities at the end of the day. So how do asset risks become financial risks? So in general, what we're saying is top management, make sure that your middle managers and frontline managers, whether people are taking parts out of stores, putting parts on work orders, those are all decisions that end up being cost items. So make sure that they know how the assets are treated financially over the entire life cycle of the assets, because it's different for different phases. So people must know, for example, what's the financial impact of retiring an asset, so that they don't just go ahead and take it out of service without communicating with anybody. What happens when you expense activities that should have been capitalized, or you capitalize activities that should have been expensed? So people need to be educated on how their activities become balance sheet and income statement items at the end of the day. We also want top management to manage asset management competencies. So competencies give the organization their internal capabilities. One of the things, it's not the only thing that gives it, but it's one of the main things that gives it. So we know that people need to be competent in their roles, but we also need competence to manage risks and liability. And here we're talking about some kinds of asset risks, but liabilities such as environmental liabilities, safety liabilities, and then other risks that we could run into in the organization, risk of failure, etc. We also know that having the right competences in place will provide assurances to stakeholders, such as your regulators, such as your insurers, such as the government, that you're actually managing the assets with the right level of care. More than anything else, we want top management to educate themselves in asset management. So there's a lot of focus on educating middle management. The reality, though, is that when they go back to their organizations, they run into a brick wall of processes that they can't change. And remember, we mentioned that some of these walls are structural walls. So in an asset management class, for example, I would teach people to use life cycle costs preferentially over acquisition costs. But they can't impact that. They can't change that if the company has a policy of using the lowest acquisition cost. They can't do anything about that. So we want to focus top management on their own education as well. Otherwise, the asset management system is not going to get implemented. We're going to run into roadblocks after roadblocks after roadblocks. So in other words, we're not trying to tell top management how to do their job, how to lead the organization. That's not what this is about. What we want you to know, top management, is that the asset management system requires some specific things from you, and you may have to adopt a different role than you have traditionally done when it comes to this particular management system. We also want top management to evaluate roles and responsibilities in the organization, especially when you get into implementing the asset management system. There might be good reasons at that point in time to reevaluate and re-clarify roles and responsibilities. First of all, you should always be ensuring that the activities that position holders are doing align with the requirements of the role. That's basic. That has nothing to do with asset management. Special care needs to be taken to ensure that the position holders have the competence that they need to do the job. Again, this is not just for asset management. This is for everything. And ensure that if they don't have it, that they can acquire the competencies so that you don't compromise asset care, but you also don't compromise decision making. That's very important. Put it this way, it is highly unreasonable to think that you're going to get through your entire asset management journey with no structural changes to the organization. We want top management to promote the integration of asset management practices into the business processes of the organization. So I'm going to put on the table, as much as I'm a consultant and I want everybody to be doing an asset management system because that's how I get paid, I also want you to know in the organization that you're not doing asset management to have a management system. That's not what you're trying to do. The goal is to get to the deliverables from the asset management system. So the real purpose of the asset management system then is to create a sustainable path to performance delivery, long-term investment planning, and risk management that recognizes both your investment planning, that recognizes both risk management issues as well as performance delivery. So asset management practices then have to be integrated with other organizational processes, and specifically, I want to mention your budgeting processes so that you don't set up an asset management system that is not connected to anything and is different from everything else that happens in your organization. There's no delicate way to put this one. So I'm not a delicate kind of gal, so I'm just going to go out and say, senior leadership should always be conscious of their own activities that may circumvent their own strategies and plans and then create knock-on effect in the organization. So what do we mean? Don't make asset management optional in the organization. Don't start asset management, Lean Six Sigma, and everything else that you can think of on the same day. You have a finite number of resources in the organization. Your asset management team will need some permanent bodies. You know the folks who can do a good job. You also know the folks in the organizations who can't. So don't make your asset management office into a burial ground or a dumping ground. Don't make it okay to skip the processes and governance, but do provide visible leadership to the asset management system and processes with things like open communication. So when the asset management office writes the policy, you should be the one to communicate it out. So in conclusion, I want to say asset management is a top management job. This is because, for one, we're at the stage now that asset management might well be the last line of defense against compounding value erosion, particularly return on asset, but other kinds of stakeholder value as well. So remember the days of the traditional top-down budget cuts, those have not been effective. All that happened was that people in the organizations did less with less. You didn't get more with less, right? So what these strategies did, if anything, was to contribute to the mounting deferral of capital and maintenance injection. And now we've ended up with very high levels of machinery and infrastructure in very poor condition. The cultural transformation is the most significant part of implementing your asset management system, and that cannot happen without top management. Remember that organizational forces are very powerful, with equally powerful informal leaders at all levels of management. There's always a guy standing up in front, but there's always a guy pulling the strings behind. So you need to, you know that about your organization. You need to be able to curtail these activities because they're very, very capable of circumventing change. The cultural shift should not be taken lightly. Don't assume that it's going to happen organically. All right. Structural changes, again, I've said this before, may be required in the organization to get this process going. Top management is the most influential change manager in the organization. So your context has powerful stakeholders, and these powerful stakeholders are no longer able to shoulder the significant consequences of asset risks. So what we're talking about is powerful stakeholders such as your lenders, financiers, investors, regulators, governments. What they're doing is that they're increasingly imposing oversight requirements on the organization that is now requiring the organization to pursue long-term investment planning, lifecycle management plans, and improve risk monitoring because they're unable to shoulder the future financial risk. That is the problem. As we are on risks, the risks faced by asset-intensive organizations are complex. So some of these are triggered by gaps in asset care. Some have been imposed by the external environment, such as regulatory complexity. However, because the asset base is complex, it is capital intensive, the solutions are equally complex and costly, requiring holistic planning and long-term planning. So we need the involvement of top management there. Asset information is not properly managed in many companies, which means it's not suitable for decision making. It creates other problems such as lack of traceability between operational activities and financial activities, leading to more financial risk and regulatory requirements and oversight by others. So the more you can streamline your asset information management system, get it up and running so that you can have that traceability, so we don't end up into a black hole and see, poop, operational activity happens and then we don't see anything else, and then we see a big bill at the end of the day. So managing asset information, I want to put on the table as well, is not an IT role. For some reason, which I think is historical, it has defaulted to IT, but it's not an IT role. If you don't have appropriate information in the organization, it will also be difficult for you to prove compliance. Remember, asset management requires cross-functional groups. It requires multidisciplinary approach. And what we've found in organizations is people may well get along as friends. People are quite nice people. However, cross-functional collaboration requires more than love people. It requires business processes and a hefty dose of process discipline. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. I now hand over to Mario.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Lots of great information. We will now move on to our question and answer part of the session. If anyone has any questions for Suzanne, please post them in the GoToWebinar Questions tab now. While we wait, I have a question. You spoke about culture. What is the relationship between culture and asset management implementation?
The reality is that the culture is what determines whether value will actually be achieved. Now, the culture is led by top management. It's created by them, reinforced by them. And by this, when we say these things, we don't mean individually one boss is there actively creating a bad culture. But by not demonstrating what a good culture is, by not requiring a good culture, then we could end up by default with a bad culture. As you know, anything that you end up with in the organization by default is also an active part of decision making. So the reality is that if you don't have an appropriate culture in place, if you don't have people working together, if you don't have a culture of decision making that encourages the use of information, if you don't have a culture of long-term thinking, then you actually will not get the value from your assets. The assets by themselves, even being very reliable, even working very well, will still not be able to create the value because you don't have the culture to sustain it.
Okay, we have a virtual question from the virtual audience. How can you sell the idea for asset management to top management?
That's a good question, and it's a challenging one because oftentimes the persons who have the idea about asset management are actually far removed from top management. So I'd say that last week I spoke with one of my clients and I said, well, how do you approach the mafia? You need a guy on the inside. So you need to identify somebody with the capability of being an executive sponsor who can speak at that level, speak for you, and also encourage the conversations and encourage the structures and systems to be set up. So in other words, I'd say try to identify somebody at the most senior level of the organization, get that individual to buy in first, and then work on the other bits of getting information out. There's also the issue of encouraging themselves to get trained. And if you approach it from the idea of what risks the organization is facing, especially now, but also in the future, then folks will be inclined to listen and to get on board. But you do need to have that guy on the inside.
Okay, we have another question from the virtual audience. In your opinion, is leadership a natural skill or a learned skill?
That's interesting. So I'm in the group of people that believe that almost anything can be learned. There are some people who have it naturally, but I do believe that if you come to the table with an open mind, so for you to learn anything, you need to have what we call an elastic mind. So you need to be able to take new information in, and you need to have one unique capability, which is the ability to change your mind. And so some people don't have that, which make them naturally bad leaders. However, most people kind of come with that skill set, and in the right environment with the right exposure can develop the ability to keep reforming and keep changing their minds and develop that elastic mind, making them suitable for leadership. So I believe much of it can be learned.
Okay. Another question is, how can we sell AM to small and medium-sized companies?
That's interesting because that's usually a group of people that believe that they have, the company is usually so small that they tend to have eyes on every part of the operations and every part of the assets. So they tend to be the hardest to convince to go down the asset management route. So I feel your pain, whoever asked that question. However, what you need to always come at it from is the perspective of risks, particularly future risks, and whether the organization is equipped as it is currently, as it is set up, as it operates, to go into the future knowing that these risks are coming up. So for example, COVID caught a lot of companies off guard, and Jim's gonna go talk about that a little bit. But the fact is, that was a risk that was sitting there in the external context that was not well developed from a risk management perspective. Then we also have other things that are in the environment. So small to medium enterprises are very susceptible to what we call market forces, which means that on a whim, they can disappear. they can disappear because they sell products and services. And if they're not efficient in the conversion of their asset management processes into these products and services in a cost-effective way, they will disappear. So knowing cost, knowing where the market is going, cost of operations, future risk of regulation in the marketplace, because you could have the most efficient operation with the most reliable assets, and then things in your external environment, such as like what happened with COVID, but also oversight from regulations, take you out. We saw that in one of the provinces a few months back, when a lumber operation had their operating license yanked after 5 years of being warned that you can't keep doing this to the environment. So small to medium enterprises are susceptible to issues related to cost and future risks. So that's the way that I would approach it.
Okay, thank you. Can asset management happen just inside of one facility without notifying top management?
No, I would say the answer is no, but I know what happened is that a lot of people who are keenly interested in asset management sit in one corner of the organization. So there's a natural temptation to say, I'll just pilot it here, and then people will see, and then they'll want to expand it to the rest of the organization. Much of the setup of the asset management system is structural the way that you would set up any other management system in the organization. This one is special because it is more pervasive than any other. It requires the active involvement of top management to even determine what the asset management needs of the organization are. What direction should we go? What should we undertake? How much should we bite off and chew? Then when you get into things like the policies are things that are directly developed and authorized by top management. So you won't get very far. You won't get past the policy stage without involving your senior management.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. What are the deliverables of asset management team group, and how can you quantify the result of AM's group results? Sorry.
So, okay, that seems like a loaded one. Maybe the person is speaking of the deliverables of the asset management system, which would be things like long-term planning, risk management, especially future risk management, and long-term performance management. At the end of the day, quantifying the deliverables of asset management comes down to quantifying these risks, quantifying the value of future performance and current performance to the organization. So once you get into quantifying, you're quantifying either the value of risk mitigation, as well as the value of the performance.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question. Any questions that we don't get to, we can always answer those during our open discussion later on today at 3:15. So our last question is there any kind of simplified or mini asset management package?
You know, you ask a good question for which the answer is yes. Not the way that you're expecting. The answer is yes, because your asset management package needs to be tailored for your organization. In other words, if you're a small to medium enterprise, your asset management system will be scaled to that. So the answer is absolutely yes. In developing your asset management system, it is scaled to the size of your organization, scale to your operations, scale to your market size, scale to how your organization is configured. So you're not a big multinational, you're not a big municipality, you're a small organization. It is absolutely scalable to what you do, and that is the way that it should be developed. So yes to that one, resoundingly.
Okay, thank you very much, and a lot of great questions from the virtual floor today. Thank you once again, Suzanne, for a very informative session. If anyone has any more questions, be sure to keep them in mind for our open discussion coming up at 3:15 this afternoon with Suzanne and James, as well as our sponsor representatives. Thank you again, Suzanne.
Thank you so much for having me.